Welcome back. In our previous lecture, we introduced what ethics is. Ethics is rational reflection on human conduct with the aim of directing that conduct in appropriate ways. We also examined different subsects of ethics, such as descriptive ethics, metaethics, and normative ethics. But we ended our discussion on an unsatisfying note. Ethics is a practical subject. It is something that finds its fulfillment by being lived out. For this reason, what the philosophers have to say about ethics still has to be put into conversation with one another, and most importantly, still needs to be put into conversation with our own lives. And so in this lecture, we will examine two of the most prominent ethical views: deontological ethics and consequentialism. These represent two fundamentally different answers to the question, what makes an act moral? Is it the motive behind the act, or the consequences that follow from it? Deontological ethics will be represented by the thinker Immanuel Kant, while consequentialism will be represented by John Stuart Mill. We look to these thinkers because they are the giants of what we call the Western tradition. So let's get started. Immanuel Kant was a revolutionary philosopher who lived in the 18th century. He offered two main contributions to philosophical discussion. First, that metaphysics, as we traditionally study it, is not possible. We cannot know reality in itself. We can only know reality based on our own perspective, using reasoning in order to get closer to how things are in themselves. This, of course, is a bold claim, especially for the purpose of our lectures. If a worldview is comprised of one's metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, yet we cannot know reality in itself, then we cannot truly study metaphysics, at least not yet. And if we cannot study metaphysics, then we all have gaps in our worldview. This is Kant's first main contribution, along with its repercussions for us. The second contribution is his view on ethics. What he offers is a duty-based ethics, or a deontological ethical view. Morality is not grounded in human nature, since we cannot know human nature in itself. Rather, morality is grounded in the will itself. It is grounded in the will itself because only the will can be good unconditionally. Other things can be good, but only in a qualified sense. For example, health and wealth can be good, if used rightly. But if used wrongly, they aren't good. It is the will that drives us to use things rightly or wrongly. So the study of ethics, then, has to be grounded upon the will. A good will must be grounded by moral duty, where moral duty here is taken to be a respect for the moral law. What makes a human act right is not that it makes you happy or feel content by satisfying your desires. Rather, what makes an act right is having a good and right motive. The right motive is one that upholds moral duty, or a respect for the moral law. And so from this, and this is the key aspect of Kant, morality is a matter of motive. Doing the right thing is not the essence or whatness of morality. Instead, you have to do the right thing for the right reason or motive. Now, Kant provides three formulations of what he calls the categorical imperative. These are commands that we can keep in mind in order to live moral lives. The first formulation is the principle of universal law. Act only according to a maxim that you could, at the same time, rationally will to become a universal law. That might sound a little bit complicated, so let's break this down. In other words, before you act, you have to ask yourself, could the principle behind my action be applied to everyone, everywhere, and without contradiction? If the answer is no, then the act is immoral. Now, this might sound similar to the golden rule, do unto others what you want others to do to you. But Kant actually rejected that comparison. The golden rule is based on what you personally want. But Kant's principle is different. It asks whether a rational agent could will the principle behind the action to be a universal law without contradiction. And so it's not about your personal desires here. It's about rational consistency. Let's take an example to see this in action. Let's say you're walking into a grocery store and notice a wallet on the ground. And no one's around. You could easily keep the cash and drop the wallet at the service desk, and no one would ever know. Let's apply Kant's first formulation here. I have to universalize the action. Suppose there were a world where people keep money they find in lost wallets. Would that be a rational law that respects each person's dignity? Probably not. In such a world, trusted public spaces would collapse. People would constantly fear losing anything because they'd assume others would exploit their situation. That's not a world any rational person would legislate into existence. Since it would not be rational to will a world where people keep money they find in lost wallets, I should not keep the money. I should return the wallet to the service desk with the money intact. That's Kant's first formulation in action. The second formulation is this: treat humanity, whether yourself or another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. This principle is akin to another one that may sound more familiar to us. We must love our neighbors as ourselves. And not love in the sense of feelings, but wanting what is good for our neighbors and for ourselves. All evil violates this principle. If we were to hate, kill, steal, or lie, we would be treating people as tools to be used, and not as persons with inherent dignity and worth. The third formulation is the principle of the kingdom of ends. Act as though you were a legislating member of a kingdom of rational agents, where every person is both the maker and the subject of the moral law. In other words, imagine a community where every person respects every other person's dignity and autonomy. Your actions should be the kinds of actions that would hold up in that community. You are not just following moral rules. Rather, you're also helping to author them alongside every other rational being. Now, there are interesting consequences that follow from Kant's formulations. For one, the existence of moral commands implies that we have free will. The fact that we ought to do what's good means we can. It makes no sense to say that a person ought to fly in the sky like a bird because human beings can't fly. So the fact that we ought to do something implies that we can choose to do it. But to be able to choose means to have free will. Therefore, we have free will. The second consequence from Kant's deontological ethics is that morality only makes sense if a morally good God exists and if there is an afterlife. This is because morality commands us to aim for the highest goods. For example, we should aim for perfect justice. But we don't experience perfect justice in this world. It's not clear we ever have. So, does that mean we should aim for something impossible? Now, someone might respond, why can't perfect justice just be an ideal that we try to get closer to, even if we never fully reach it? Here, Kant would say that's not enough. If the moral law commands us to aim for something, then it must be genuinely achievable. Otherwise, the command itself is irrational. And since perfect justice is clearly not achievable in this life, Kant argues that it must be achievable somewhere. There must be an afterlife where there is a perfectly good judge, God, where everything is in perfect moral harmony. Otherwise, morality becomes irrational. We'd be aiming at something impossible, which just makes no sense. Therefore, the moral law assumes both the existence of the afterlife and the existence of an all-good God. Without these, all of morality falls apart. So having looked at Kant's deontological view, we can turn our attention to John Stuart Mill. Mill's consequentialist view, known as utilitarianism, is probably the most influential ethical philosophy in contemporary America. We might ask, why are his views so popular in our own day, especially in America? And there are really about two reasons for this. First, because the ethical system is very simple and easy to grasp. Philosophers have a tendency to use difficult words to communicate simple concepts. Mill does not do this. Secondly, because this is an ethical system that, at least on its surface, seems attainable by all. Most ethical systems, like that of Aristotle or Kant, are demanding in ways that many people struggle with. Many of us aren't consistently virtuous, for example. We usually have a mixture of virtue and vice. Similarly, many of us don't consistently act from pure moral duty in the way that Kant requires. Sometimes we do, maybe even many times, but not consistently. Mill's ethical system, by contrast, appears more straightforward to follow. There are three key points to his ethics. First, morally good acts are those that will produce the best consequences. So if you want to know if an act is good or not, look at the consequence and act accordingly. But what is the best consequence? How do we know what that is? That takes us to his second point. Mill identifies the best consequences with the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. If an act can generate happiness for as many people as possible, then that act is a good act. If the act does not generate the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, then the act is not a good act. Let's take an example. Imagine a city needs to build a new highway. One proposed route would cut through a small neighborhood, displacing 20 families. But it would reduce commute times for tens of thousands of people. Another route avoids the neighborhood, but adds 30 minutes to the daily commute for those same tens of thousands. For Mill, the moral choice is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The highway should be built through the neighborhood, even though it's painful for those 20 families. That's his second point. His third point is this: happiness is identified with pleasure. If we think about it, it doesn't make sense to say that the happy person doesn't feel pleasure in being happy. So Mill takes pleasure to be the key component of happiness. Of course, there are different kinds of pleasures. There are pleasures we get from eating good food. There are pleasures we get from being with friends or having, say, a light bulb moment go off. So not all pleasures are equal. Some are greater than others. And so to summarize, a morally good act is one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, where happiness is taken to be the highest kinds of pleasure. This is an ethics that takes into account everyone and, at least in principle, appears more accessible than that of Aristotle or Kant. That said, it's worth noting that calculating the consequences of every action is no easy task, and that's something we'll return to later. So far, we've looked at the ethical systems of Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill. While their views are very influential, they did come under attack in the 19th century, most memorably by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a strong critic of the moral systems that dominated Western thought, including Kant's. While Kant believed that morality is a matter of motive grounded in rational duty, Nietzsche believed that our motives are masked, that the origins of our moral systems reveal something deeper and more uncomfortable than philosophers like Kant were willing to admit. To uncover this, Nietzsche distinguishes between what he calls master morality and slave morality. The easiest way to begin thinking about this is to think about the difference between bad and evil. Imagine you are taking a walk in your neighborhood and you find dog poop just lying there. You'd probably think, ew, that's gross. Why didn't the owner pick up after his or her dog? You sidestep the dog poop and continue your walk. It would be bad to step in it. You're not tempted to step in it. It would be disgusting to. Now let's take another example. Sometimes people in relationships end up cheating. Of course, no one says cheating is good. It's a very wrong act. But something tempts the person to cheat. They know it's wrong to do, but they end up doing it anyway. So there are some bad things that disgust us. We are not tempted by them. No one is tempted to step in dog poop. But there are other wrong acts that do tempt us, and we aren't necessarily disgusted by them. Some people, for example, are tempted to cheat. Those disgusting acts that we aren't tempted by is what Nietzsche would call bad. Whereas those wrong acts that we are tempted to do, Nietzsche would call evil. Evil things tempt us, while bad things do not. We sometimes want to do the evil thing, but don't, for whatever reason. Now, this distinction between bad and evil is useful for getting us into Nietzsche's way of thinking. But his actual argument goes deeper. For Nietzsche, master morality and slave morality aren't just about personal temptation. They are about the historical and social origins of moral systems themselves. In master morality, the strong and noble define good first. Good is what reflects strength, creativity, self-determination, and excellence. Bad, by contrast, is simply what falls short, what is weak, common, or unremarkable. The person living under master morality isn't tempted by what's bad. They are disgusted by it. They define their values from a position of power and self-assurance. Slave morality, on the other hand, arises from a position of resentment. Those who are oppressed or powerless look at the strong and label them as evil. Only then do they define good as the opposite of the powerful. Good in slave morality is akin to something like humility, meekness, and obedience. But Nietzsche argues this good is not something the slave truly desires. It's something the slave clings to because they lack the power to live otherwise. In slave morality, morality is reactive. It is born out of resentment rather than genuine affirmation of life. So why would anyone choose to live under slave morality? Nietzsche notes that it's because these people believe that justice will come about in the afterlife. That in the afterlife, they'll get to have the greatest happiness in heaven, while those who followed master morality would be damned. The people following slave morality hope for the afterlife as their vindication. But, and this is Nietzsche's final blow to those following slave morality, if you're living just to wait for the afterlife, just to wait for some kind of redemption, then what's the point of your life here and now? You'd just be waiting to die. If you're just waiting to die, then you're really a nihilist. You believe that life here has no meaning. But life does have meaning. Nietzsche insists this. The meaning is whatever we make it out to be. Meaning is whatever we will, whatever we desire, and whatever we create through our will. We don't look to the intention of an act, as Kant thinks, nor do we look to the consequences of our action, as Mill says. Rather, we are to look to ourselves. We are artists who create reality in the way we see fit. And for Nietzsche, that's living life authentically. Nietzsche's critique of morality really stunned philosophers, both because of just how shocking it was, but also because of how powerful his arguments were. In Nietzsche's view, you can't say you're trying to live a good life if your ethical theory denies life. You can't have a good life without life. And from Nietzsche's perspective, both Kant's and Mill's ethical theories deny life. They take our authentic desires and suppress them, either for some abstract moral code or for pleasures that might not actually be the kinds of pleasures we want. Now, whether Nietzsche is right about this is something each of us has to wrestle with. But this challenge is one that philosophers have taken seriously ever since. Now, this takes us to the 20th and 21st centuries, our own day. Nietzsche took the prevailing ethical theories and seemingly brought them to rubble. The whole 20th century, the 1900s, was a period of time where philosophers started re-asking the very basic questions of ethics, the same questions that we saw the ancient Greek thinkers asking. Even in our very own day, we are trying to figure out a sturdy foundation for ethics, as many people in our own time disagree. This should raise an important question for us then. Has philosophy made any progress? During one of our earliest lectures, we looked at a passage from Bertrand Russell, who says that the value in philosophy is not in finding the right answers, but in asking the right questions. Progress in philosophy is when we know which are the right kinds of questions to ask. This brings us to our contemporary age. In our own very day and age, philosophers are returning to the thought of the ancient Greeks and Romans, the medieval philosophers, and the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers. We are revisiting these thinkers, but with new eyes. It's like watching a movie. When we watch a movie for the first time, we are usually confused at the beginning with what's happening. The end of the movie sheds light on the beginning, but we don't get to appreciate the movie in full until we re-watch it another time. Our appreciation doesn't deepen because the movie changed. Rather, our appreciation deepens because we change. We have new eyes to see what was always there, but that we just didn't catch. That's like progress in philosophy. By looking at these later thinkers, like Kant, Mill, and Nietzsche, we get new eyes to better appreciate what the ancients and medieval thinkers thought. With this, we get to put the ancient thinkers into conversation with the modern ones. That's philosophy's progress. We take one step forward and two steps back. Not in the sense that philosophy is regressing, but in the sense that philosophy is like a dance, like a waltz. And now, seeing these thinkers, we know the steps. The question going forward is no longer, what are we going to do with philosophy? Rather, the question is, who are you going to be?